As the Great War consumed the globe, one power had managed to stand aloof from the disastrous conflict. But the relentless assault of global warfare was to eventually awaken this sleeping giant and, a century ago today, the United States would finally set aside their inhibitions and set off abroad in search of monsters to slay. This was the first time that the US had embarked on a major overseas war and was, to all intents and purposes, barring their short dalliance with colonial endeavours in the 1890s, their first real deployment of troops outside the Americas. Indeed, many observers never expected to see American boots on European soil, even after the declaration of war, so anathema was the concept to the American nature of the time. The decision to enter the war had not been taken lightly, with military involvement facing considerable domestic opposition. The significant German-American community had naturally opposed taking up arms against their erstwhile countrymen, whilst the Irish-American community demonstrated a deep resentment to the idea of giving military aid to the British Empire. The US also had to contend with an anti-interventionist ideology rooted in over a century of avoiding involvement in European and foreign affairs. Many commercial interests had also vocally opposed involvement due to the profits to be made from financing the catastrophic ongoing conflict. Nonetheless, the closure of the frontiers in the 1890s had left many Americans hungry for adventure, an ideal closely linked with the founding mythology of the United States. It was this temptation that had in no small part contributed to the short but effective process of US colonialism and war with Spain, and likewise had led many Americans to enlist to fight with the Europeans. US citizens circumvented rules of nationality to fight in the British Army and fly in the French Air Force, amongst others, and an American had been killed in combat on the Western Front by early 1915. In spite of the general domestic concerns, circumstances had made the official neutrality of the United States and the outwardly pacifist Woodrow Wilson an increasingly challenging proposition. Whilst the British blockade of the Central Powers from the outset of the war had provoked mercantile outrage in the US, German excesses in their occupied territories and refusal to respect neutrality had done much to sour relations. These diplomatic failures had been further exacerbated by the effective tactics of demonization employed by Allied propaganda ministries. Breaking point in the German-American relationship came primarily as a result of the German U-boat campaign. As U-boats could not follow the same rules of war as surface vessels, their use had always been contentious, but the deliberate sinking of neutral shipping and the accompanying loss of life infuriated the US. The deaths of 128 American citizens with the sinking of the RMS Lusitania was the most famous example, but not the first, as the merchantman William P. Fry had been torpedoed in January 1915, 4 months prior. American losses may not have been particularly high, but a steady drip of attacks caused considerable outrage. The German use of submarines was sporadic, and was indeed constrained to mollify the US, but their position in early 1917 appeared so precarious as to make a further period of unrestricted U-boat warfare seem the most probable means to secure victory. The failure of the Imperial German Navy to break the British stranglehold on trade showed conventional naval methods to be futile in the face of Allied supremacy at sea. Whilst an expanded U-boat fleet, and assurances from Grand Admiral von Tirpitz that such a method would starve the Entente into surrender before the United States could enter the war, led the German government to approve a resumption of the strategy of unrestricted U-boat warfare in February 1917. The assumptions behind the enterprise were flawed. The US immediately severed diplomatic ties, and despite an initial increase in sinkings, the Allied assumption of convoys quickly countered the submarine threat. The German contingency plan in case of US involvement, the infamous Zimmermann telegram, which was to incentivize Mexico to declare war on the US if the US should go to war with Germany, was also decrypted by the British and presented to the US government, further souring relations. Unfortunately for the Central Powers, the Russian Empire was to utterly collapse as a result of civil strife only a month after the declaration of unrestricted U-boat warfare, making the entire enterprise pointless, and creating for the Central Powers a newer, stronger enemy through their provocative action. The United States declaration of war on the 6th of April 1917 had little immediate military impact, save for providing a huge morale boost for the exhausted Entente powers, but it did allow for more direct financial and material aid to be delivered to them. The clock was now ticking, however, for the Central Powers, and their leaders knew this. The United States as yet had one of the smallest standing armies in the world, but had profited from a huge expansion of its industrial capacity through the relentless demands of the European powers for munitions. Trained men they may have lacked upon the declaration of war, but they could produce the materiel required to outfit an army in eye-watering proportions, and a huge swell of volunteers saw the US potential expand exponentially. Once the US declared war, the Central Powers could only hope to win if they could smash the Allies before American forces arrived in such numbers as to hopelessly swamp them. Whilst the subsequent collapse of Russia did free up huge volumes of experienced men, they could still never hope to compete. It was this impending doom that led to the daring, if rash, Kaiserschlacht offensive in early 1918 that was to finally see the elite of the German army bled dry and speed on the eventual Entente victory. Of more long-term significance was the comparatively light cost of the war for the United States. This is not to suggest that the American soldiers did not fight gallantly, but they were not engaged in so many attritional battles as to endure the mind-numbing casualties that were to so scar the psyches of European nations. The United States entered the Great War at a time in which the Entente were at their lowest ebb, and ended it as both the protector of her values and banker to the Old World for the loss of comparatively little blood or treasure. This war experience was to redefine the American global outlook, and whilst the 1920s saw an attempt to return to the isolationist ways of the past, the genie of interventionism had been unleashed and was to shape the direction of United States foreign policy from that moment to this day.